Meet Reid Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reid is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reid.
This is Reid Lance Rosenthal on the right side, broadcasting to you at a KGB AM 650 and the Town Square Network, serving the Intermountain West, KFEZ, Colorado Springs. Welcome, Colorado Springs in northern New Mexico. And KCEG 780 AM The Monster out of Denver, Colorado. Howdy, Colorado. I have a great show for you guys today. It is absolutely timely. I have on the phone with me a gentleman who is nothing less than distinguished, and particularly in European finance, Georges Ugeux. And if I get your name wrong, George, you just scream, will you? But he
Reid, it's perfect.
Perfect. He was the chairman, and I'd rather be lucky than good any day, you know. George was a chairman and CEO, or he is the chairman and CEO of Galileo Global Advisors. It's an investment firm, but more importantly, his studies in philosophy, economy, law, and a 40-year financial career has included running a conglomerate of 76 European banks, involvement in the European Commission. In the United States, he actually led the international group of the New York Stock Exchange. He's taught at various colleges, including the Catholic University of Louvain, the College of Europe. He was associated with the program for financial institutions at the Harvard Law School, and the accolades go on and on and on. But I think we can say that George is an absolute expert in international finance, and particularly in the European sector of international finance, which, as you folks probably know, is kind of cratering. If you go back to my archives, I warned you about this 2 years ago. I was one of the very first in the press to tell you, keep your eyes on Europe. It's the bouncing ball. So, George, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Reid.
Listen, you know, it's going to be very interesting for the audience because in reading your various blogs, George writes for the Huffington Post, folks, and you can follow his blogs there. But he and I are probably of divergent political opinions, particularly when it comes to our illustrious president. And so there's going to be, I think, some really interesting communications back and forth here about Europe, America, policies, why America might, shall we say, take a different route than Europe if we keep following the same policies, etc. So stay tuned because I really think it's going to be a great interview. And actually, George, I've been looking forward to this interview for a couple weeks. And the fact that it happened like 2 days after the government of Cyprus, at the behest of the European Union and the European Central Bank, demanded that depositors basically skim 6.75% off the top of their deposits and fork it over to the government with no warning, is like perfect timing. So let me ask you a question. Let's start with the big picture. In Europe, and folks, once again, you can go back to the archives. I got all sorts of facts and figures there in previous shows, so I'm not going to bore you with them. George, you wrote a blog in the Huffington Post, and it was September 13th, actually, 2012, overburdening the European Central Bank. And, you know, it's really, I think, one of your best articles out of many, many good ones. We have quantitative easing in the United States. Folks, you can find out about that in the archives, too. Basically, the Fed's printing money. Now, the European Central Bank, as I told you back in that show, is doing the same thing. George, why is the European Central Bank printing money, and what's it doing to the European Union, i.e. that collection of states over there across the pond?
Those are two different things. But, Reid, basically you have to see the ECB quantitative easing as a way to lend money to banks at 1% for 3 years, which they did irrespective whether they were Greek or German, but that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the problem we have in Europe is that banks have a difficulty to trust each other. So they prefer to deposit their money at the central bank And therefore, if you want to get the liquidity and you want to have the money playing around, you really need to have the European Central Bank relending that money. But the problem is that when you do that, your balance sheet goes up. And we're not talking about $3.5 trillion for Europe, and it's a bigger one compared to the size of its economy than the Federal Reserve. And that's where the worry starts clicking.
But, isn't it true that basically the European Central Bank is kind of like the Fed over here? The Fed over here is buying mortgage-backed securities and United States bonds and treasuries. Over there, they're buying the sovereign debts of the struggling country, namely the pigs, and particularly Spain and Italy. I mean, it's different nomenclature, but it's the same kind of approach, right? Print the money, use it to prop up sovereign governments and large banks, and worry about the consequences later.
I understand that, but there is one difference, and it is the composition of it. When you are a German taxpayer and you see the European Central Bank buying bonds from Italy, you are asking yourself, while you are working 50 hours a week, why you should finance people who go on pension at 55, and why you should actually bail out another country, which never you have to do in the United States. The Federal Reserve is supporting the U.S. government, but it is not supporting other governments. So you have this big difference, and by the way, the European Union has taken a big commitment, and the BCE has basically said, we are going, no matter what, to support what it takes to keep the euro in place. Thank God they haven't had to do it yet, but it's coming.
Well, yes, and we talked about that on previous shows with this audience. I mean, when the European Central Bank said they will do whatever it takes to support the sovereign debts of these struggling countries, I mean, that's really kind of like the Fed, the unlimited spigot,
Yes.
It's on, there is no date that it'll be turned off, and there's no staunching the flow of money instead of water. However, George, there is a similarity between the European Union and the United States. See, over in the European Union, the Germans are scratching their heads and going, why the hell are we supporting those lazy Italians and Spanish folks down in the South? Over here, the folks in Wyoming and Alaska and Texas are going, and we're supporting Illinois and New York and California. Why are we doing that? I mean, there are many similarities between the states that comprise the United States and the sovereign states that comprise the European Union. And I really think, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Because the same angst that the Germans feel is the same angst that the people in Wyoming feel. We have a 500,000 person state with a $15 billion surplus. California has 36 million people with a $16 billion annual deficit and $110 billion state debt. So in the end, the money that's redistributed from Wyoming is going to the poorer states, just as in the European Union, the rich countries are supporting the poor ones. And, the same gritting of teeth, the same anger, I think, is apparent in Americans, who you could equate to Germans in the wealthier states, as the Europeans, the Germans, are figuring, when they're supporting the less poor countries. But the bigger question that I want to ask you is, how did Europe get in this mess?
It got into that mess because when they created the euro, they had not only what is called a big treaty, but they had another one which was supposed to keep financial stability. The problem is that the two countries that got in trouble because they had overstated their budget were Germany and France. So they decide, yes, okay, there are some measures here to correct it, but that's not for us. And then everybody stopped being disciplined. And then there have been issues in Greece where they were unreporting their debt. Goldman Sachs was helping them, to make sure that the debt was becoming a swap so that nobody saw it. And then all of a sudden it blew up. Yes, man. Yes, sir.
Yes, players over here too.
Right. Remember one thing, the head of the central bank in Europe is a Goldman Sachs guy. The former prime minister of Italy is a Goldman Sachs guy. The head of Goldman Sachs in Europe is an Irish former prime minister. So, Goldman Sachs is pretty good, not just in Washington.
Yes, where we had the pleasure of Tim Geithner for 4 years, a Goldman Sachs guy, as the head of the United States Treasury.
Yeah, but don't forget Paulson, though. Let's make it even.
Exactly. It's the same tentacles on either side of the big pond.
Yeah, exactly, and they are both sides of the aisle. They are very smart.
But, besides the fact that obviously there's some book cooking going on, and besides the fact that Goldman Sachs is profiting on both sides of the pond, whether things go up or down, putting that aside, why is Europe, and this is where we're going to start perhaps getting into some of our ideological differences, why do you think Europe is in the plight that it is? I mean, it goes beyond finagling balance sheets, right? If you go to the base, somebody had to spend too much money, right? Yeah.
And basically, you have to make a difference between two categories. The first thing is you have some countries like Ireland and Spain where what happened is that the banks have been lending money left and right for mortgage and real estate, and we had the same as your subprime crisis, so the government has to step in. Those countries didn't have a public debt issue. And then what you had is situations like Italy, Portugal, and others, where the real problem is that the social spending that hits the budget every single year is something that those countries can no longer afford. And so what they need to do now is reduce that social spending and raising taxes. Exactly the same problem as in Washington.
Exactly. So in Washington we call it welfare, Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, and over there they call it social spending.
Correct.
But it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Yep. And the problem is exactly the same.
What percentage of the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, and I guess now Cyprus, what percentage of their annual budgets are in social spending in European terms?
I would say probably something like 20-25%.
20 to 25%?
Yep.
Did you know that the United States, and I'm sure you do, is over 60% of its budget?
No, that's not exactly true, sir. From what I know, the United States is about 35% on Medicare and everything. What are you adding to that? Education?
No, I'm not adding education to that.
Education is a big chunk.
Just the social programs, because one of the things that they do to cook the books in the United States, just as they do in Europe, it's all one big Ponzi scheme, is they do not talk about the unfunded liabilities.
Oh,
the unfunded liabilities, which, there's estimates from 86 trillion to 211 trillion. I use 110 because it's kind of the low middle. But they increase at the cost of living index every year. And there's a full-facing...
Yes, but let me take that issue.
Sure.
I haven't even talked when I talk about 20 or 25%. I'm not talking about the unfunded. We have to be very realistic here. Unless something is going to happen in the next 10 years, Europe will not be able to pay pensions. And they don't even work on it. So what really drives me nuts here is that we are overspending now for people like me who are oldies, and then the young kids, when they will be in work, they will realize that 60% of their money is going out to pay the pensioners. So what is going to happen then socially and economically? And that's where the biggest danger is.
Yes. I mean, in the end, I think the social upheaval that an economic collapse would cause is the biggest single danger. And the way to avert that, of course, is to avert an economic collapse. But where I'm going with this is that the spending on entitlements, as we call them over here, or social programs, as you call them over there, is the root of the problem. It's the root of the annual deficits in budget spending, and it's the root of long-term debt problems. And whether you want to count the unfunded liabilities in each and every country and the fact that the full faith and credit of the government is behind their increases every year or not, the bottom line is that there's huge percentages of these, every government that's in trouble right now, you can trace it back to the spending on entitlements or social programs, whatever nomenclature you want to use. So what I know that you're a supporter of President Obama. Okay, I am not. What in his policies, bringing this back to the United States, is, number one, different than what we've seen lead to ruination in Europe. And
the biggest difference between Europe and the United States is defense budget and wars. We have about the same kind of spending on entitlement and social security and all the jazz. But the biggest difference is that we don't have 20% of a national defense budget. And second, we haven't gone to Afghanistan and Iraq. And that costs a few $1 trillion to the budget. So that is where the biggest difference is. We have to cut substantially on the social side, but the question is how many wars can America still afford?
Well, I somehow I don't think it's all defense. I mean,
well, it's not all.
I think defense plays a role, and obviously we're kind of shall we say dancing on the head of a pin, because one of the reasons Europe doesn't have to spend the money on defense is that they're under the American umbrella.
Yeah, sure. Because
I mean, bottom line is, what you're telling me is Europe's going to have to stand more on their own 2 feet in terms of defense. America's going to have to do less, and everybody's going to have to cut social spending.
I agree.
Did that sum it up?
Absolutely true.
Okay. And let me ask a question. Let's start with Europe. If Europe does not get its social spending under control, if these faltering governments over there, Cypress, I mean, folks, I don't know if I'm sure you've heard about it, because it roiled stock markets and markets across the globe, including the NYSE. But basically, Cypress just came out of the blue and said, everybody who has money in a bank, and I'm going to make this really simple, we're taking 6.75% of your deposits, thank you very much. That started a run on the banks. You had a great article in the Huff Post on that run, if you will. And you had 2 articles, actually, George. I read them both. They were both great. One of them was Cypress. Europe violates the sanctity of insured deposits. And then your next article was waiting for a run on the banks. Explain to people, number one, what Cypress did. Number 2, what that does to a mentality. I mean, I'm sure most people listening to this understand that if they wake up one morning and they hear on the radio that the government's going to take 6.75% of all the money they have in the bank, the first thing they're going to do is go down to the bank and get their money out.
I'm going to make it simple, so it's going to be simplified. You can imagine half of an island, because the other half is Turkish, and that half is Greek, okay? And they have been to the European Union because the Greeks pushed them. And the Turkish side is not part of the Union because the Greeks don't like the Turks. So for 1 million people, you are starting to see a banking sector that is 8 times the annual production of the country, while in the United States it's about 75%. So we are having a country that has been massively laundering money. And guess who is on the other side of it? The European Union for about 50%. The banks, European banks are owed about 39 billion euros. But the other part, just to make the whole thing fun, is the Russians.
Yeah, the
Russians have put money there. They bought houses there. They like the climate. It's a little bit better than in Moscow during the winter and all those kind of things. So at the end of the day, the Russians are there. So all of a sudden, because it's the Russians, we say we're going to take the Russian money. But there is something that didn't work. And that's what blew the whole story, is that there is a rule in Europe, which is that all the central banks and other systems have to be put in place so that you never touch a part of your deposit, as you had in the US for $250,000, that is 100,000 euros, that in any event you sure will never be touched. And the biggest mistake that Europe did, and Cyprus, is to touch those 100,000. And so
Because if I understand what's happening over there correctly, and we're far away, you're much closer to it, but what's happening is that in reality, I mean, even though they're blaming the poor Prime Minister of Cyprus, it's the European Union and the European Central Bank that said, if you want further support from us, $10 billion or so, you're going to have to get the money, and this is where you can get it.
Yeah. And believe me, they didn't think that they were violating their own rules and the sanctity of insured deposits. They blew up the possibility of creating a scheme in Europe. Now, who did it? I am to be honest. Mrs. Merkel in Germany wanted to take out 40%, not 675. So that's how the whole negotiation started. And it was a crazy move. But now, once you have lost your virginity, there is a big problem to get it back.
Yes. In fact, it's virtually impossible because the faith and confidence in the banking system and the sanctity of people's deposits, if they thought about it today, even if they back off, then what's to stop them from doing it tomorrow? I mean, that's in the back of everybody's minds.
Yes, and remember one thing. It was to be voted today. It was rejected with no yes vote by the parliament. But on Thursday, the people started to get their money from the ATMs, and then there was no banknotes left anymore. So they started trying to do transfer of funds to other countries, and then the central bank basically blocked any internet transaction on the banks. So before anything was explained, before anything was voted, the Cyprus people couldn't get cash and couldn't transfer money. So that is what created what you call the run on the bank. That happened in Cyprus and is still going on at the moment because the central bank is only going to reopen, I think, on Thursday, and then the system will work back normally. Now, will it open? We don't know because everybody thought that the parliament would have accepted eventually because they need the 10 billion euros. And that's where the issue is, that they would have accepted the trade-off. They turned it down today, so we're back to square one.
Okay, so now we come to the United States. Let's bring this home, okay? So we've seen what's going on over there in Europe, and some people yawn, and many people don't understand the interconnected world in which we live, particularly in finance. Although the tentacles of Goldman Sachs everywhere should tell you about its interconnection. So in the United States, what types of things could cause this type of bank panic, this type of bank run, that are realistic? Obviously, all sorts of nasty things we can't contemplate could happen. But in your opinion, seeing what you've seen in Europe, and the two of us agreeing on how to get these budgets and deficits under control, what could trigger a bank panic in the United States?
The bank panic could come if there was a weakness of one big, so-called too big to fail bank. We had the stress test of the Federal Reserve last month. Besides Goldman and Ally Financial, who need more equity, nobody needs more equity. The system is today more solid than it was in 2007. So, honest answer, I don't see anything that could create a run on the bank or any panic in the banking system in the United States under the current circumstances.
Okay, but don't you think there's some other things that might trigger a bank run?
Not a bank run, because a bank run is really an extreme situation. What will happen is that, as you have seen during the subprime crisis, poor people are going to become poorer, and they will have no home, or they will have no car, or they won't be able to pay for the tuition of their kids. So there are going to be a lot of things, but that is not, in my view, something that could create something like a run on the bank. Where I'm concerned in Europe is because the people in Southern Europe are kind of hot blood, If you could have something like we had in Tunisia, or the people basically getting from demonstration to some kind of a revolutionary reaction. That is the thing that really was me. Because there is one thing we know. When the people are desperate, they go out and fight because they have nothing to lose.
Well, look,
I don't think we are in that situation in the U.S. at all.
Isn't that the same thing with governments? I mean, what Cypress did is the act of a desperate government. Desperate governments do desperate things just like desperate people do desperate things.
Yeah.
So in the United States, though, I mean, the only thing that really separates us is 6 degrees of separation from Europe. And that 6 degrees of separation is the fact that we are, at least for now, the reserve currency of the planet.
Correct.
And that allows us to print money.
Yep. And it's not only that. you are one of the most trusted. The United States is one of the most trusted country in the world when you see at what rate they borrow. The U.S. Treasury borrows below 2% at 10 years. Now, historically, it has been much higher. So we are in a situation where the interest rates are low. But let me tell you something tricky here. Unless we do something on the debt, which we absolutely have to do, we cannot continue having 100% of GDP in debt. Unless we reduce the debt, if the economy picks up, interest rates are going to go up. And if interest rates are going to go up, guess what? Uncle Sam will have to pay more money to borrow. And that goes straight into the budget, and then we get into the vicious circle. So that is the scenario that could lead not to a run of the bank, but to a serious financial crisis.
That's exactly right. Everybody listening to this radio show remembers 5% interest rates, right? Everybody.
Yeah.
That 5%, folks, at $17 trillion, do the math. It's just under $1 trillion a year in just debt service. Correct. That money has to come from somewhere, and as we've discussed on this show, there's only one source, folks, your pocket or your property. And I guess in the case of Cypress, your bank deposits. So,
let me tell you one thing so that people understand. This is not happening overnight, and it takes time, so some measures can be taken. Let me tell you why. The entire debt of the United States doesn't see its interest rate go up. It's the short end that sees interest rate go up, because the 10-year bonds that we issued at 1.5%, they are here for another 9 years. So it's not going to be what I would call a nuclear bomb, but it's going to be a long sliding in difficulty. And people anticipate that. So if that happens, then we are going to be in trouble. On the other side, look at the stock market. People are reasonably optimistic about the United States at the moment.
Well, look, I'm going to have to disagree with you a little bit. I mean, I think money is flowing to the United States because money seeks safe haven, just like water flows downhill.
Correct.
And the United States is a wreck. It's just the least of the wreck on the planet. In other words, it's not that we're great; it's only that we're the best of the worst. And there's a big difference in that. Just out of curiosity. How do you think, because I know you're an Obama supporter, how do you think Obama has handled, if you remember correctly, in 2008 he promised to halve the deficit within 3 years. He has promised repeatedly to get the debt under control. He has promised social, you call it social spending, I call it entitlement reform. He's promised all sorts of things. How do you think he's done on those?
Let me put it this way. The United States of America have done a very lousy job. Now, I understand why you would say it's Obama. I am going to tell you Congress is blocked. And for Congress to be blocked, both sides have to be blocking the whole thing. So I am not trying to be partisan here. I'm not trying to say this is Obama or this is the Republicans. What I'm trying to say is Washington is a wreck, not the United States of America. Washington doesn't function anymore.
But wrecks are caused by lack of leadership.
Correct.
Good leaders sort out wrecks and get them back on the track. And in this country, as you know, the president is the leader.
Yeah.
So if the leader doesn't lead, wrecks don't get sorted out. If the Republican Congress passes 42 bills for jobs, 11 of them with 400 votes, that is a majority of Democrats in the House, and they go to the Senate where Harry Reid, at the behest of Obama, doesn't even bring them to the floor, then, while there's a logjam and everybody's at fault, I think there's more fault that could be apportioned to the Democratic side of the equation and to Mr. Obama's lack of leadership than to anything else. And that's not to say that not everybody plays political games. But the bottom line is we have a leader who wanted the position of leadership who refuses to lead. And
the question I have is, I understand what you say, and you and I are probably going to disagree when it comes to apportioning it. But I don't think it matters, actually, where you apportion it, because it's where you vote and where your sensitivity is. My problem is the United States of America. And my problem is that it seems that back in Washington, the people are much more concerned about their own well-being than they are about the country.
No doubt.
That is what really makes me nervous. Because what we will need, what we are doing now, you remember that story? We had this great bipartisan agreement for $4 trillion decrease of the debt over 10 years. There was, I think, a year or two ago.
It was 2 years ago.
It never went through. And I'm not trying to say who voted for and who voted against. I'm just saying we had a bipartisan agreement. So why don't they go through? What is blocking the decision
Well, actually,
process?
that bipartisan...
You are saying it's the leadership of the president, and I'm going to tell you one thing. As much as I like him, and I think he's doing a lot of fabulous things, I don't think he is the kind of leader who is behaving in a way that will create the bipartisanship that we need to resolve the problems. But he's not alone, and I don't want to blame only Barack Obama.
Yeah, I would agree the blame can be spread, but, in terms of that $4 trillion almost grand bargain they called it 2 years ago, that deal was pretty much done. Obama came back to the table and wanted $440 billion in new taxes. And
if that was the case, he was stupid.
After it was agreed. Now, see, my thought is he really doesn't want an agreement. We might get into that later in the conversation or maybe on a subsequent interview because this is fascinating. But my thought is this guy talks a lot, but what he really wants is no agreement. What he really wants is to keep spending. What he really wants is the Cloward and Piven orchestration of crisis imposed upon the United States. And that's, I think his motives are far more sinister than you attribute to him, which is a lack of leadership and, shall we say, taking steps to diminish and to undermine negotiations. But we may get into that toward the end of the show. We'll see. More importantly, specifically, what has Barack Obama done? What has he even proposed? And I don't mean the rhetoric off the teleprompter saying, we need to get the budget under control and we need to get social spending down and all the nonsense that you hear. What specifics has he proposed to get this mammoth problem that you and I agree we face? What has he done? What has he proposed?
He certainly said that there were some things that you were willing to sign. I would say that there is one thing that I give him credit for, is that we are gradually stopping to be the cop of the world. I think the United States of America have to care first and foremost about the American people. And whether we go to Iraq or the French go to Mali or the British go to Tripoli or whatever, it's about time that we stop being the cops of the world. We don't have the money to do that. We overspent in those things. So that has something that he has done. Now, if you are telling me, did we get the great bargain on the table and eventually voted for? Clearly not. So you blame it on Obama. I blame it probably a little bit more evenly between the Republicans and the Democrats. But at the end of the day, Reid, whether you blame the left or the right, my issue is that when the train doesn't function, you can say that's because you don't have the power or because you have too many brakes, but at the end of the day, the train doesn't leave the station. And
that's right. And
that's what bothers me.
And who's in charge of the train? The engineer.
Well, the problem I'm saying, that's what I'm trying. No, I understand your point. I'm just saying, I accept that he's the guy who runs the train. But if there is another side of the house who is putting the brakes, he can do whatever he wants. The train ain't move.
Okay. You were talking about the cops of the world. I happen to agree with you on that. I mean, we need to do less globally, but we need to focus on some big problem areas, which if not focused on are going to cost us umpty-ump $trillion, not to mention put in jeopardy the safety and security of the American people. And I'm talking about North Korea. I'm talking about Iran. It makes no sense to me. On the one hand, you and I agree that Obama is disengaging us from some things around the planet which A, cost money, and B, we don't need to do, and C, somebody else ought to be doing, or let everybody go out and kill themselves in whatever locale it happens to be. But, explain to me how in the middle of the world is going to stop screaming and moaning and campaigning over the sequestration. We're given $250 million to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. We're giving them 18 free F-18 Phantom fighter jets. We're giving them 35 free Abrams tanks. Folks, those tanks cost about $16 million each. The jets are about $85 million each.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, how do you square that, George, in your mind with, on the one hand, you think he's disengaging, and on the other hand, particularly in the middle of the sequestration uproar, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, you know, he sends $250 million off to Egypt, who by no means is a friend of our closest ally, Israel.
We are one of the biggest weapons seller in the world. We sell excellent planes, excellent tanks, and excellent machine guns and bombs and everything you want. It's the business we're in. We could decide not to be in that business at all. As long as we're in that business, we got to sell it. Now, the problem that you're facing is that traditionally, we never got paid up front when we were selling weapons. And here we are giving some weapons to Egypt because apparently we have some confidence that the Egyptian army at least works and that the weapons are not going to go in the hands of the Brotherhood. We'll find out whether that's true. You are raising a big issue, and you are raising probably the biggest issue that we are facing now in defense, and it's the nuclear threat. The difficulty is that we're trying to stop other people from getting the bombs, but they always claim that since we have it, they should have it. Can we stop nuclear arsenal? Absolutely not. Can we try to limit it like we do in North Korea and we try to do it in Iran? We should. Should that be the only thing that defines our foreign policy? There is a point where I have problems because I happen to know Iran fairly well. I've been there. I know Iranian people and so on. And I'm not talking about the ones who are here. The reality is that the Iranian people love the United States. They copy our movies. They copy everything that they can get their hold to. And the Iranian regime is in the hands of religious fanatics. So, in my view, rather than just focusing on the nuclear, we have to find a way to give democracy a chance in Iran. And if democracy comes in, and it's no longer the mullahs who run it, maybe they have no interest in creating
George,
a bomb.
I agree with you 100%, but, you know, we had our chance in 2009, and Obama blew it.
What do you mean?
Right? Well, you had uprisings in the streets of Iran. You had people, you know, there's a zillion videos. You can just go Google it, saying, you know, Mr. Obama, are you with us? President Obama, are you with us? Is the United States going to support us? I mean, the regime in Iran was close to toppling, and he did nothing. Zero. Nada.
I don't know what he did or did not because you and I know that it's done by the CIA. But let's go back to the situation today. I have the impression that the new elections in Iran are going to provide a completely different landscape. And contrary to what some people are doing, this guy, the North Korean guy, the kid, he's probably much more interested in making business with the West than in launching bombs. The problem is like all kids, you know, he has the army behind. And the army wants to send nuclear bombs and build nuclear bombs. The reality is, as you said, can we destroy that? If we have capability to destroy nuclear arsenals, I'm all for it. By the way, it doesn't cost human lives normally. We should be able to do that with drones and planes and bombs.
Well, if
that is possible, we should do it. The problem is the following. Before you do it, Jerusalem ceases existing.
I'm sorry, repeat that?
Before you even send your bombs to the nuclear arsenal in Iran, Jerusalem and Tel Aviv are destroyed. Because this is a war where you cannot hit everybody at the same second, and if those guys send it, what are you going to have? You are going to have destroyed the nuclear facility in Iran, and you are going to have a complete war zone in Israel. So I understand the rhetoric, I understand the religious leaders in Israel, but what I'm trying to say is that if it were as simple as sending a few stealth bombers and destroying their capacity, we would have done it a long time ago. Mr. Bush would have done it.
Yeah, see, I disagree. I think Bush was a lame duck president in his last 4 years, and maybe rightfully so, because, you know, and some things he did well and some things he really screwed up. Yeah. But I don't think Mr. Obama has the stomach for it. I don't think he has the ideology for it. And as I've told you, and as I've told my audience, you know, I think that the results he really wants, contrary to his rhetoric, are results that you and I could not fathom. And it's all for ideological power and control purposes. But putting that aside, because we won't agree on that, we agree that we should take out the nuclear capabilities of these two rogue states, North Korea and Iran. And I would offer that the time to do that is long before they have a bomb. In the case of North Korea, long before they have a sophisticated guidance system for their long-range missiles. They have the bomb. They have the long-range missiles. They don't have the guidance system yet. So, you know, literally, I mean, if it were up to me, if I was El Presidente, tomorrow, North Korea would not have any nuclear capabilities, and neither would Iran. And whatever it took.
Would you do the same in Pakistan?
If Pakistan started getting out of hand, absolutely.
It's a complete rogue state. They are the ones who are hosting the people who are killing our troops in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, listen, I am all for, I think the best defense is offense.
If you're sure to win. If you are sure to win.
I am not one of these people to wait around.
No, I agree.
Somebody repeatedly tells me he's going to punch me in the face. I'm not one of these ones to wait around thinking, gee, the clouds are going to part, the sun's going to come out, and this guy's going to change his attitude. I'm going to make sure he's incapable of punching me in the face.
I understand what you say, but let me tell you one thing that I'm concerned about, because I don't know enough about it. So I'm not claiming I'm right. If we attack North Korea, South Korea will be bombed. If we attack Iran, we're going to have the same story in Israel. If we attack Pakistan, we're going to have India being attacked. So the problem is, what is currently the best solution that we can find? I am really worried about what is it that we can do that would really be efficient and not run the risk of a terrible retaliation.
Well, you know, a terrible retaliation comes on two levels. I mean, if people are going to fight with you and they're committed and devoted to the concept of fighting with you, let's keep the fight, you know, you have a choice, knives or guns, or the analogy is tactical weapons or nuclear weapons. Let's keep the fight on a tactical weapon basis. I mean, I would much rather be involved in a conflict, an attack on India, you know, an attack on Israel with conventional weapons, than to wait with my fingers crossed, believing that, gee, these guys really aren't that bad, or the elections are going to change things, or this kid over in North Korea really wants to do business with the West, because if I'm wrong, I'm really wrong.
You're right.
And the one
by
thing
the way,
that I know
the whole Middle East would like us to do that.
And the one thing that I
would like us to do it.
And the one thing that I know I'm right about, somebody can't drop a nuclear bomb on you if you remove their nuclear bomb. That I know I'm right about.
That they are in one place and that we know where they are.
Well, you know,
I'm not a military guy, as you can hear.
I think we have the capabilities to A, either know, or B, flush them out and take care of it rather rapidly. You know, the United States military is more competent than the situation in Benghazi would suggest. I mean, you know, we have the capability to launch cruise missiles from 1,000 miles away that will strike a target in 7.5 minutes. That's pretty quick response.
Yeah.
So, you know, you and I agree. I guess we disagree a little bit on maybe the route to take to achieve the same result.
But we need to get there one way or another.
We need to get there one way or the other. And this ties right back into the finance part of this, okay? Because, once again, America, with its debt burden, and America with its social program burden, is kind of getting in the same, shall we say, level as the Europeans. I mean, one of the reasons the Europeans don't have big armies is they can't afford big armies because all their money goes to social programs. And when I say all, I mean a huge chunk of their money goes to social programs.
That's true.
So my question to you, George, is in addition to just the debt, the finance, the burden on our kids and our kids' kids, and the eventual, the train's going to hit the wall that we agree on if we don't get it under control, what does the debt in the United States, if we don't get a handle on it, what does it do to our abilities to defend ourselves and to take preemptive action where it's necessary to ensure that American lives and security are as safeguarded as they can be? What's your opinion on that?
We spent $4 trillion combined in Iraq and Afghanistan, okay? And that was never using some of those big weapons. So I think what is happening, and I think we are going to see it happen, is that the military guys are changing the U.S. Army to give it less people to be killed on the ground and more devices to retaliate or attack people. And we are ahead on the drones. We are ahead on. Should we drop a nuclear bomb in Iran? No. Could we find ways and means to destroy some of their equipment? Yes. Are we sure that if we do that, Israel is not going to be wiped out? I don't have an answer to that question. But the debt is tying our hands.
Yeah, the debt undermines everything. It
Exactly.
Undermines every
and that.
single...
I mean, it's like at home. I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We all have the same problem. All of a sudden, millions of people found out they couldn't pay their mortgage. Okay? When a family can't pay its mortgage, it starts looking at what it can cut. And then it starts saying, can I send my kids to college? And you start destroying the fabric. And that's what I don't want to see. So we need to solve that debt problem and live. And by the way, the United States, vis-à-vis Europe, is a country where the cost of living is much lower, and we live very well. So
Absolutely.
Europe has
and one
to
of the
learn
reasons we do is that we are the reserve currency of the world. That's probably a
Absolutely.
25% difference in quality of life.
Yeah.
Right there. And, there are countries actively working, as you well know. I mean, you know a hell of a lot more about international finance than I do. But the BRIC countries, China, India, Russia, are all working industriously to unseat the dollar as a reserve.
I'm going to tell you
currency of the world.
something that some people might not like when they listen to it. I am going to India and to China. And I am going to Europe, and I live in the United States, and I'm American, okay? Bottom line, those guys work. We don't.
Yep.
I
agree.
We have become lazy, comfortable. We love our life. We want to see our shows. We don't want to work late. Those guys don't have that luxury. They are not going to beat us because they have more money, more weapons, or anything. The risk is that they might be beating us just because they work better and more.
Right. Better work ethic, at least as it pertains to half of this country. But, don't you think that malaise, that lack of work ethic, that lack of incentive comes right down to the fact that 50%, give or take, of this country goes out to the mailbox once or twice a week and there's a check there from Uncle Sam? Why should they work?
It's not what we have. I mean, you know that some people get that check. But I'm going to tell you something that you know as well as I do. Okay, you go to your city and you go to a Starbucks or you go to a restaurant. Does the waiter pay attention to you, or do they chat among themselves? Does the food really be attentively cooked, or is it just thrown on you? My problem is we need to go back to what makes America great and what has created America, which is the feeling of being winners and that unless we roll up our sleeves, nobody's going to give it. The problem of Europe is that since the war, and even before, we have been basically assisted people who basically got the money from the government for all kinds of things. Can you imagine in France, if you want to get rid of somebody, it might take you up to 3 years of unemployment benefits? I mean, how can a country live with that? And why would that guy try to find a job? In Europe, you have people who, for the third generation, are unemployed. The grandfather never worked, the father never worked, and the son doesn't work. So that is what we need to eradicate in Europe. But where there is a danger in America at the moment is that we are becoming complacent with ourselves when it comes to working and rolling up our sleeves. And that's a moral issue, it's an ethical issue, it's whatever you want to call it, but it's a very fundamental one.
And you know what? We agree 100%. Let's go one step further. What has Mr. Obama done to address that? He apologizes for the United States. Yeah, I think you will agree that his tactics, to put it kindly, are divisive, whether it's by race, by religion, by social caste, by economic level. What has he done to bring this country together and to instill in it that sense of greatness that it had, that sense of winner that it has, or at least that half the country has, and the incentive to go out and create and work, produce, make jobs, make businesses, create wealth? What has he done?
The reality is that he hasn't done what I expected him to do. But I am going to be tough on corporates. In the United States of America, the non-financial corporations are sitting on $2.5 trillion of cash. They are not investing. They are not creating jobs, which is what America was doing. So the question I have now is, what is it that we are going to do to go back to work, to invest, and to use that money and not put it in U.S. Treasuries, where you don't get any money back anyway? So that's a big issue. The companies don't invest and they don't recruit.
Well, and not only that, listen, a large portion of that $2.5, it's actually closer to $3 trillion, I think. A large portion of that $3 trillion is being held offshore. It's being held offshore because the United States has the highest tax rate in the world, 35% corporate tax, right? So
you don't have the highest one. Let me tell you something that I know very well, because that's an area where I know something.
Great.
Companies are structured to minimize taxes.
Right.
And when General Electric, and I work for General Electric, doesn't pay federal taxes, I have a problem.
Huge problem.
Whatever that happens. They can pay taxes on something else. I don't care. The reality is that they enjoy the contribution of this country in terms of infrastructure and all kinds of things, and they should pay their share. So the question I have is, why do corporates not pay taxes, and why are they going against households?
George, you and I are absolutely in simpatico, okay?
Yep.
I mean,
but both parties are being
But look, Jeffrey Immel is great buddies and a huge campaign contributor to your guy, Obama.
To both.
Jeffrey Immel was named the head of the Economic Jobs Council by Mr. Obama.
Yeah, I remember that story, yeah.
In the 2 years that he was the head of the Economic Jobs Council, 110,000 jobs from GE went offshore. This is the guy who's appointed by your president to head the creation of jobs in America. And on top of that, with a $14 billion profit, they pay no taxes. We can go right down the list. Goldman Sachs, Google, to some extent Microsoft, although some of their divisions pay tax. I mean, these are all Obama fawners.
But you know where I would agree, Reid.
Obama has often said that he wants to see a restructuring of the tax code. The Republicans agree. Lower the corporate rate. Obama has said that a bunch of times. You can Google it up. Google up Obama, lower corporate taxes. And when you get right down to it, despite all his rhetoric, all he does is block proposals to get done what he has promised the American people he will do. Because until you make it until you give economic incentive to companies to repatriate their money and to begin to circulate it to create products, goods, services, and employment, it's not going to happen. And
what kind of incentive can you do when the company doesn't pay taxes? You cannot even reduce the taxes; they don't pay them anyway.
It's real easy. You get their tax rate down. You give them certain credits for employment of a certain duration and of a certain level, and you close their loopholes, which is creating a condition under which they don't pay taxes. But
I'm going to ask you another question.
Obama is more concerned with getting their campaign contributions than he is with what's doing right for America, despite the fact he gives lip service. He knows what's right. He just doesn't do it.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
America lives on credit cards.
Absolutely.
Average rate 15%. Borrowing cost of the banks less than 1%. How long are we going to let that tolerate?
Well,
How long are we going to continue to let the financial world blow up money like the $6 billion in London for JP Morgan or others? How long are we going to let that work continue? The individuals and the working class, are paying the bill.
Absolutely, George. You and I agree 100%. But, this goes back to the same crony capitalism I was just talking about.
Oh, yes. I can't agree more.
And the crony capitalism starts with the leader.
The crony capitalism has, I'm going to say it slightly differently. The crony capitalism has corrupted the leadership of this country. Now, you might say it's Obama. I'm telling you it's the whole leadership. Because the money goes to everybody who's down in Washington.
But listen, you and I, there are very few exceptions to that, and you and I agree. But you know what? Somebody who can be corrupted is somebody without principles, period.
Yeah.
It's a basic character flaw that they had long before the poor slobs who voted for him put him in office. And I'm not just talking about Obama. I'm talking about Democrats and Republicans alike who fall into that category, and there's plenty of them on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
And until you change campaign... I think the key to getting something done on real tax reform, which will spur this economy, something getting done on real tax reform in which everybody has skin in the game. And by the way, that means if you're on welfare, you write a $50 check to the government. You walk the streets, you breathe the air, you're protected by the Army. Welcome to the United States, give me your $50. And if you're GE and you make $14 billion, you pay whatever the corporate rate's going to be when the smoke clears and the dust settles with no loopholes. 15%, 13%, 18%, whatever it's going to be.
I agree.
I mean, you and I are in absolute agreement. From the poorest to the richest, everybody puts in something.
And the thing that is important here is the following. When the people get crushed by credit card rates, mortgage rates, all kind of stuff and costs, and don't have the money, we don't have a purchasing power. What does that mean? There is no growth. We are killing the golden goose of this country, which is the middle class. Absolutely. And, where you and I will differ is that I believe it's intentional and you believe it's just misguided. Well, I have a question to you on this one. Sure. When Obama came in, he said, we are going to clean Washington, okay? Washington is as corrupt as it has ever been, and it's not going to change. What does it take to try to eradicate corruption in Washington, to try to get those people to think about the good of the country? Well, I think it starts with if you really want to know, I think everybody has the cart before the horse. You're not going to get this tax deal done. You're not going to get these deficit deals done. You're not going to get these sweetheart pork barrel deals that everybody says shouldn't be done but then does on every single bill. You're not going to fix all that until you change the campaign laws. And my proposal is it's $5,000 per person or entity or corporation or union. That's it per campaign. No going out and forming 50 LLCs that can each give $5,000. No bundling money. None of that stuff. It's $5,000. You can give $5,000 to a senator.
You can give $5,000 to the president. You can give $5,000 to the guy who's challenging the president. That's it. Because if you take the money out of the campaigns, if you take the money out of the, shall we say, ability to purchase power and therefore be corrupted. Because
you know what is funny about it? Where does that money go? 80% subsidizing television.
Of course. Of course.
So what is the rationale of giving so much money to people who are going to spend it on television ads? I mean, do we need that? Is there an added value in anything like that? Zero.
You and I are in agreement that the bottom line is that there's so much money at play, $1 billion in each side, is that money can be funneled into all sorts of nefarious extemporaneous activities. It takes the eye off the ball and it corrupts the process.
Entirely.
So if you change the campaign laws, if you take the money out of the political equation, I think you are a huge step forward to politicians being uncorrupted and focused on what they're supposed to be doing, which is serving the public interest rather than their own, whether it's personal power, personal greed, or personal ideology, and in some cases, all three.
Absolutely. Amen.
So, we're in agreement. I can't believe we have about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna just take a quick station ID here. Hold on one sec for me. This is Reid Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio. It's KGAB AM 650 and the Town Square Network serving the Intermountain West. Hello, Montana, Utah, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. And it's KFEZ in Colorado Springs serving southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. And the Monster 780 AM in Denver, Colorado. I'm on the phone with a gentleman. It's amazing how much we agree on, George. When you really get right down to it, even though we may approach certain things from kind of a different perspective. But I think you and I agree pretty much.
We have the same values, Reid. We know what matters.
Values. Yes, we have the same
values. We agree.
Sure.
We disagree on who is the bad guy, but that at the end doesn't matter because we have to get the values back in the middle of it.
Yeah, well, listen, they're all bad guys. Some are just worse than others.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, listen, George, I know you have a book that's been published overseas that's going to be coming out in English, and it sounds fascinating. I want to make sure the audience hears about this before I get into this last question, because believe it or not, we're approaching an hour. But this is basically The Betrayal of Finance, 12 Reforms to Restore Confidence. It's been published in French and Dutch, right?
And it is in English now. You can get it on lulu.com, and you can get it on Amazon and whatever. And you can even get it for $5 under an ebook form. So it's not a money issue.
Oh, dynamite. Now, and do you have a website that you'd like people to go to, George?
No, I think my website is a business website, and it talks about all kind of things, deals that we're doing. No.
Okay, no problem.
Follow me on Huffington Post.
Yes, right, folks, he writes for the Huffington Post often. I don't always agree with his articles, but they're always insightful, and I think you'll find them fascinating. And once again, the name of his book, when did it come out in English?
A year and a half ago.
Oh, really? Okay, super.
I will send you a hard copy just for you.
That would be terrific. The Betrayal of Finance, 12 Reforms to Restore Confidence. And we're talking with George Ugeux. Look, let me give you his spelling, folks, because it's a little bit different. It's Georges, Ugeeux. That's Georges, Ugeeux. And I want to finish up with a kind of a final question for you, George, because actually this interview went differently than I thought it would, and I'm quite pleased with it. I want to have you back, too. And as a matter of fact, with what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the United States, this is a topic that's just not going to, unfortunately, grow old. When all is said and done here, I think you agree, I think from what I've heard, you agree the United States is kind of following the same path as the struggling countries in Europe are, which
they are in that direction, and they are far away from it. Believe me, the situation is a lot worse in Europe.
Well, yes, but once again, that's kind of a relative term, right?
I agree.
How bad is bad?
Exactly.
So what would Americans? I mean, you are an international financier. You've basically been in high positions in the European Central Bank. You've run conglomerates of 76 banks over in Europe. I mean, you've run the international portion of the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, I would say you are relative. You're brilliant, and you know what you're doing when it comes to international finance. I want the folks to hear from somebody with your perspective, instead of just the rancher from Wyoming, me, or my other guests who also pontificate. What will happen to the United States of America if we don't get our act together and we continue down the road we're on?
We are going to become poorer and poorer every single year. The middle class will gradually vanish. The ultra-rich will remain ultra-rich because they are working on the planet. And the reality is that we see that happening at the moment because the number of people who are now below the line of poverty over the last 10 years is increasing. That is what is unacceptable.
We agree. And what does this mean for our kids and our grandkids? I mean, let's assume the United States does not alter course. We continue spending. We do not rein in entitlements. We do not get smart, at least, in our application of the military budget. We continue to rack up $1 trillion debts on a primary debt level. Forget the unfunded liabilities. And interest rates go up to 3, 4, 5%, which they're destined to do. I mean, that's going to happen. When do you see the train hitting the brick wall?
It's very hard to say, but if the scenario that you're describing is happening, I would say between 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Not longer than that.
And that in the relative scope of history is a blink of an eye.
It's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow. Exactly. George, it has been an absolute pleasure. I would love to have you back on again in a month or two. How's that sound to you?
Perfect. I
Okay,
enjoyed the
super.
conversation, Reid.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time. It's been really insightful and a true honor to interview you.
My pleasure.
Have a great day. This is Reid Lance Rosenthal on the right side, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. I found it hugely insightful. Hopefully you did too. I mean, this guy knows more about international finance in his pinky than I do on my leg. And you heard it from him there at the end of the show. 5 to 10 years max, and it's going to be ugly. We don't have a lot of time to get this ship turned around, and we got to start working on it. Get out of your normalcy bias. Get busy. Talk to others. Get them involved. Talk to your representatives, state, local, and federal, and start kicking some butt. It's your future. It's your children's future. It is your country's future. This is Reid Lance Rosenthal on the right side. We'll talk to you next week.
For more information about Reid and his work, please go to ontherightsideradio.com. There you can also click to purchase the first 2 volumes of his #1 best-selling historical Western series, Threads West, An American Saga, and Maps of Fate. And now the first volume of his new nonfiction series, Land for Love and Money, is available everywhere, or go to landforloveandmoney.com. That's Land for Love and Money. We'd also like to remind you that if you've missed any shows, you can go to the show archives on Reid's ontherightsideradio.com webpage. We look forward to seeing you again next week for another episode of Reid Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.